So thank you very much for joining us for the session on how can people in the water sector embrace market openness. Now, market openness and data, what do we mean by that? I just want to give a bit of context. We've seen that I think the water industry has significantly invested in digitalization and is starting to use technology and data at scale across most of its operations. But we've also seen in other sectors like open banking, where the sharing of data across an entire industry has created another push of innovation and economic development that might not happen without the data sharing that can happen across an industry. So that's what we mean by market openness, opening up a market for innovation by making data more accessible. Now we have with us today to discuss this and to get to that discussion, Claire Simpson from Ofwat and Michael Hull from Northumbria and Lisa from the ODI team. And we might also have Vikki from our water team, Arup's water team joining us, but we're doing a bit of technical due diligence in the background. So perhaps Claire, if you could introduce yourself briefly, I'll just go around the screen and bring the others in and then we start the discussion.
Sure. Hi, my name is Claire Simpson. I work at Ofwat and I've been responsible for the work around introducing open data in the water industry from the regulator's perspective. And we recently published a report about the progress that the industry's made in this space and what we'd like to see going forward.
Thank you, Claire. And Lisa, you are next on my screen.
Hi, everybody. Yes, I'm Lisa Allen. I'm the head of consultancy for data programs here at the Open Data Institute. So actually, I've been working with Claire on that open data strategy. But in previous roles, I also worked for the Environment Agency, where I led the release of 2,000 data sets as open in 1 year. So yeah, quite a subject close to my heart.
Fantastic. And Mike, over to you.
Hi everyone, yeah, I'm Michael Hull. I'm Intelligence and Analytics Manager for Northumbrian Water, and I've been leading a water industry initiative on open data known as STREAM, where we're bidding for funding from Ofwat's Innovation Fund to try and catalyse open data in the water sector.
Great, that's what I love about the ODI, data. I'm the Chief Data Officer for Arup. We're a global engineering and consulting business, and have been sort of ODI partners and sponsors since the foundation of the ODI, I think. So let's get straight into it. And please post questions, which the ODI will help moderate, and we'll start to see them coming through. So we'll also weave your questions into the discussion. But if I kick off with, so how would the water sector benefit from more openness? You know, what might be an example that we could do in the future or that you've seen in your work to date that sort of makes this tangible and accessible for our discussion? Who would like to start, or should I just pick? Mike, great.
I'll give you so the benefit of our experience from Northumbrian Water. So I guess our open data and open innovation journey started sort of 5 or 6 years ago. We ran our first hackathon in 2017, following a bit of exploration as to what we could do with data. And for us, really, it was the benefit of being able to bring in diverse thinkers from outside of our sector to look at data, very much related to our organisation's performance, and to try and understand, could somebody tell us things that we didn't know about our own company, about our own sector, and about the services that we provide? And the answer was very much yes. There are lots of things that we can learn from outside of our sector. And really, we wanted to use that experience and use the experience of identifying additional value from data, and use that to kind of mobilize the industry as a whole.
Okay, you're on the screen, but without your camera.
And really benefit from open data sharing and open innovation.
Like that's quite interesting. 2017 is when we started sort of our big data or strategy on that too. It seemed to be in the built environment around that time when companies got more focused on. I might come back to that a little bit. And Claire, what do you see from the regulator's point of view right now? So potential for innovation around open data and sharing?
So I think it's probably worth us explaining where we think our role kind of sits in this, because it's quite important context for why we think this is so important. You may traditionally think that the regulator's interested in open data because we're big on transparency and we like to see what's happening in the companies, but actually that's really not the kind of viewpoint that we've taken on open data, and I think that's a really important point to make. So we've been working over the summer and over the last year or so, engaging with the industry and other stakeholders and companies like Northumbrian and others about what the benefits might be. And we really see that innovation, like Mike said, is a really important one. I think we've identified efficiency as being really key. And we also think there are opportunities to explore benefits and services and products that could be offered to customers, both in the household and non-household side. Obviously, transparency is part of it. It's one of the things that you can get from open data, but we definitely see that this has the potential for much more wide-reaching benefits.
I mean, that's very interesting. We in Arup invested in this whole data strategy work because we thought there were some efficiency gains, but really the drive for innovation and solving the problems in front of us was probably the biggest motivation. But right now, when we do a data program, 60% of the cost is spent on ingestion, transformation, cleansing, sort of what we call the inefficient, or the activities that are not really creating value for our clients. And that's why we think data sharing or open data would help with that. And we could swap it around, go to 40% being on data infrastructure and 60% being on value creation. Is that the same in your experience, Mike, with Northumbria, in terms of how complex it still sometimes is to make data work for us better?
So certainly, typically, yes, 60, 70, 80% of time invested in a data project, simply acquiring, standardizing, and managing the data in such a way that it becomes useful for a data analytics or data science project to make use of. Multiply that by all companies in the water sector, and suddenly you've got a real challenge in terms of how do you actually make that data fit for purpose in a format that's really enables that value to be driven from it. So as part of our strategy, we've really looked at the foundational activity around data standards, around data sharing, the open data market, and we've identified key capabilities in order to enable all those things to happen. And I think possibly the water industry has attempted this before. So there have been a number of attempts at open data in the past. And I think possibly where they were unsuccessful was trying to go straight to that point of, well, let's just release data. Let's see who comes and plays with that data, who tries to find insight for us, without investing up front in some of the, maybe not quite as exciting, but certainly essential aspects of those foundational capabilities. We feel that we've set out a plan and a roadmap to be able to embed those within the industry. They'll come with some cultural challenges. There's a real variation in terms of maturity across the sector. But if we move forward as a coherent group within the what we're calling our Stream Open Data Group, we're confident that we can enable that and make that happen.
So if we just bring Vikki in, who could join us. Thank you very much, Vikki, for...
Hopefully you can hear me.
coming. We can hear and see you perfectly now. Sure. So could you just introduce yourself briefly, and then I'll weave you into discussion as we move forward.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you all. I'm Vikki Williams. I'm Arup's digital water lead, and I have been spending quite a lot of my career working with data in the water sector to drive benefit and value. And I think this is a really good time to start having these discussions about how we solve some of those wider challenges which go essentially across boundaries from water companies and needs multiple stakeholders.
Yes, I think Claire, so you have your hand up.
So I wanted to agree with Victoria, but I think it's also important to pick up the point that Mike said, which is that, there are 17 incumbent companies. dozens of retailers and new appointments in water. There are a lot of players in this space, and certainly from the kind of incumbent monopoly companies, there is a wide range in terms of understanding their own data, how they manage that data themselves, and then what the possibilities are around opening data. And, you know, Northumbrian and others have been at the kind of forefront of leading those discussions, which we're really pleased to see. I think another thing that Mike picked up that I just wanted to reinforce was, you know, we don't want the companies to open data for data's self. It really needs to be outcome driven. And I think some of the potential outcomes in water are really, really clear at the moment, including the environment, achieving net zero. There are some really big problems that open data could really help to address.
Lisa.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Claire. It is about the outcomes, isn't it? It's not about for the sake of it. So I think when we've done stuff like this before, when I've done stuff like this before with Environment Agency, when we released open data, it was helping local people tackle flood issues. There was lots of insight that we gained from releasing that data and the innovation that came from it. So I think it's really an enabler and to help that. I mean, at the moment, if you think about climate change and the environment, protecting that, I think that's the biggest challenges that we've got going on right now in the world and the UK. So I think it helps that, and it should really be seen as that enabler. But getting that right and the maturity of the organisations to manage that data, I think it's not just unique to the water sector; it's across many sectors. That actually there's a data literacy gap. Or some skills that are needed to make sure we can level that playing field to really maximise that open data and get to those outcomes, because that's what it's all about.
And that's certainly for us, the ecosystem is not just within the water industry. We're doing water work that applies to transport planning and energy and city planning. Vikki, what do you see as a good example or a good case study where we have worked with data at scale, or where open data was available from people like Mike or other organizations that allowed us to move some innovations forward?
Thanks, Volker. I think one of the ones that we certainly found quite useful was the open data that's available through the Environment Agency and Natural Resources Wales, where they've made quite a lot of their catchment data available through APIs. And to pick up the point from Northumbrian Water, we've been recently working with them to actually use that data to look at the impact of that on their treatment works. So, for example, what we wanted to do was to try and say, could we treat the cleanest water possible? So if we know what's coming down the river through Northumbrian's monitoring in terms of river water quality, but also we know what's happening through Met Office rainfall data, plus also soil moisture data, we can start to have an impact of understanding what the water quality impact is on water treatment works. And therefore that can help with the investment planning in the future, because you might not have to put in as much treatment, or you might be able to use more storage, and that will give different solutions to the industry, which could be much more carbon beneficial. And I think that's a really useful project where data across different areas have been used to deliver quite substantial value to the companies and to the customers ultimately.
It's quite a nice segue into one of the questions that's been posted, which makes a reference that in open banking, we've seen the development of data value chains. So the people who create the data, like Northumbria, might not publish directly to a company like Arup that adds value to the data. There might be intermediaries who provide value by cleansing, transforming, aggregating, to a point where we can then do the analysis that Vikki has described. How do you see the role of this sort of value add companies across the data value chain, creating also jobs and opportunities for startups and other organizations to grow into this open water or open data space? Who wants to start on that? Mike.
So I think for me, in terms of the objective of the Stream Open Data project is to enable that participation, and we, recognizing that as a water sector, we're not best positioned necessarily to develop our own technologies or our own, artificial intelligence algorithms to be able to come and make best use of the data. There are other organizations or other third parties or other academics who can do that much better than we can, being really honest. I feel there's a certain level of standardization that we're going to need to be able to enable that, and we can get to a point where we can share that data into those environments. And the way I see it, it's like an ongoing hackathon. So we're just fresh out of the back of our innovation festival at Northumbrian Water. We ran some data hacks, we explored data with some innovators, and we created scale as a sector in real time all the time. That's a really efficient way of demonstrating, who can really extract data, who can generate further value from our data for us, and who should we work with in that ecosystem.
Yeah, that's why we're quite excited to have Ofwat. So not Claire, you're not all of Ofwat, but why we have Claire here and Lisa, because we found in other industries like open energy, you need a catalyst. You need the regulator to sort of help bring people together and perhaps define standards or set out how industry can share, but also organizations like the ODI that can apply their theory of change around what data foundations are, what data knowledge is, what data infrastructure is, how data institutions work. So maybe you two could talk a little bit about your work together on how you're helping the industry to move towards working with big data.
I can probably start. I mean, I think we probably need to give the industry a bit of credit in this space. That what was really good about the engagement that we did over the summer was that we realised that there was already quite a lot of activity and collaboration. I mean, the leading piece at the moment, obviously, is Mike and the Stream kind of group, and that was really reassuring to us because we're an economic regulator. We're just getting to grips with the idea of data and data analytics as an organisation. We are by no means the expert in this space, and I think what we'd really like to see is the industry taking the lead on looking at what needs to be implemented. And we're very open-minded about what our role might be in the future. And we certainly think this is very important. So if we need to be more involved or if we need to push a little bit harder, we're up for doing that. But there are people in the industry who are already progressing this at a pace that didn't need an awful lot of pushing, quite honestly.
I work in Arup across all our verticals. I won't tell you who are the worst, but water is definitely in one of the leading verticals right now, which I think had to do with the previous 5-year cycles quite heavily prioritizing digitalization. And I think that prepared some of the ground for now thinking about data too. Let us move forward a little bit towards challenges too, because the potential I think we all see. And in the questions, there is a posting whether perhaps the regulator at some point needs to be stronger too. But if I come back to open banking, the regulator was very strong at the beginning, but in the end, it was that $43 billion global open banking market that really pulled everybody through. Is that similar? Do we need something at the beginning to encourage people to engage and orchestrate them, but then we hope the market will pull through? And that's probably for all the panelists, the question.
I mean, I'm happy to go first. I think that's what we would like to do, and the publication that we issued about 3 weeks ago is the start of that conversation. What we're not planning on doing right now is taking a formal regulatory role. So you see in energy that there were license requirements put in operators' licenses. We're not looking at that right now because we actually don't think it's necessary, and we would only take those types of steps if we thought it was necessary. There's also an extent to which we're not the right people to prescribe how this should look and how it should be introduced and how the standards could work and what kind of platform might be required. And we see that there are people like Mike and others in the industry with a huge amount of capability and experience to be able to really kind of lead on those conversations. But that's not to say that we don't think there's a role for us. We're going to be we are an active stakeholder in this space. it's going to have, open data has the potential to have huge implications on the way in which we regulate, never mind how we may introduce it into the industry. And we don't rule out formalising the role of open data in the future. We just don't think that that's a necessary step in water at the moment.
And Elisa?
Yeah, so I think that's right with Claire. And I think it brings in the maturity of the industry actually at the moment and the data maturity. So I think it's about having that across the piece. So I think I know Ofwat's been on a journey on looking at things in a different way, even to say, you know, it's going to potentially change the way that they regulate. So that's a big step. It can really turn things on its head. So it's how much do you get involved to start with compared to how much the market will change. And as Claire said, I think, you know, it would be very dependent on the response. But I think seeing some of the challenges and barriers, I think it's the same for many companies. It's often we start with the data or the technology causing some of the barriers or challenges, but actually it can be a cultural thing. So it can be fear of sharing. Those sorts of things come into play quite strongly. So it's about focusing on the holistic approach, isn't it, rather than just on the technology or just on the data, but it's the whole ecosystem.
So Mike and Vikki, what do you see as barriers or challenges that we have in front of us in your work?
So certainly from our perspective, we ran a number of proof of concepts to test out some of the strategic thinking that we developed last summer. So about this time last year, we ran an event where we had three initiative, 3 activities, and we looked at how we could test out those strategic foundational activities I talked about before. Actually, one of the easiest bits was standing up the infrastructure, the technology to be able to ingest data from a number of companies in different formats. The standardization was relatively straightforward for the examples we chose. There are some much harder ones to get stuck into later. The difficulties, the barriers came later on when we started to look at the data sharing agreements, the protocols for ingestion of data between different companies, and how we would put those legal framework in place to be able to enable all of that. That consumed far more. So the 80-20 percent that we talked about before, 80% of the time was spent working out how to do it. The doing it was relatively straightforward. I would say that in terms of the regulatory driver and the aspect that Claire talked about, Ofwat's involvement. Ofwat provide us with the guidance and the focus. We have performance measures. We know what our challenges are. We know where the regulator wants us to improve performance. So that gives us the purpose of our data innovation in open data. And the regulator, so Ofwat and our other regulators, have been really supportive right the way through this journey. That engaged stakeholder role that they play has really benefited the entire stream group.
Vikki, what do you see in our work in Arup as barriers, or maybe in the industry, also the broader clients you work with?
Yeah, in previous work, I did an investigation into would organisations share data for public benefit and wider benefits, and across the different sectors underpinning it and looking at the analysis, it definitely did need a regulatory nudge to get it going. And it might be the case that the work that Ofwat has done with the companies is enough to get started, but I wouldn't rule out that might have to be a further nudge down the line, because like banking and insurance sectors, they needed to have a nudge to get started before the value came rolling in that we saw, and what you mentioned before with the 48 billion prize. I think in terms of building on Mike's point, in terms of setting out the challenges that we have as we work with data all the time, we have a lot of challenges around the description of data in terms of how data is described and the metadata and how it is different across different areas. And very specific example could be very, very simple in terms of things. How do people describe a level, or how do they describe what their pumping system is, or things like that? There can be variation across there, and sometimes that can lead to a magnitude of results that could be completely different because of the way the metadata is described. And the supply industry has been working quite hard through the British Water and BIM for Water group on how we can get some standard templates across the different areas, so we can start to describe our systems and data models, and that the supply chain to that uses some of those common standards to support the companies to deliver their outcomes.
The work in London with the Smart London Board, we came to exactly the same view, and we called it fixing the plumbing. And people sort of thought this was a bit sort of the boring part of a data strategy. But just to put it into context, in Arup, we've spent in the last 2 years several £million on establishing standards around data interoperability within Arup and some of our clients and partners. And these are very inefficient systems. The average cost for data ingestion and transformation in other sectors is 40% of a data value chain. We are at 60% or more. So if we could remove that, it would definitely unlock more time and more focus on the things we really want to do with data in the water sector. There's a question in the chat about the EU Open Data Directive that is including utility sectors, and whether this might be impacting. I assume less now, but in terms of formal regulatory institution, in terms of lessons that can be learned or collaboration or how Europe is addressing that. Lisa, was that part of the original work, or do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I was just looking at that question actually to look to see if it applies to the UK now, obviously because we're out of Europe. But I think the lessons that we can learn from any of these, the work we're doing is about, I suppose it is about tackling those things like Vikki said, with making sure we're aligned on standards, because actually this is not just a water industry thing. If you're going to get the real value from data, it's actually combining it with the whole of the ecosystem with other sectors too. And that can be really difficult. I know from my work I did previously at Ordnance Survey, even when we referred to beaches and things, other organisations that were also publishing that data referred to it in a different way. So that made it really difficult for people to join up. So I think if we are going to look at this, it's not about tackling it just in one sector. I think these standards have got to be broader and looking at across the piece, which also makes that then like a bit of an elephant. And where do you start with it? Because you don't want to do everything at once. But so for the water sector to align, first of all, I think that's a really good step, but also keeping that eye for that broader ecosystem.
Maybe that's a good place for a little plug. A couple months ago, ODI helped us write a report on data sharing in the built environment. I will put that link out. It talks bilateral sharing, data pooling, and decentralized sharing across the built world. We're coming closer towards the end, so I just want to give some early warning to have you sort of key amazing point that will sort of transform all the audience and make sense of all the things we've discussed. I mean, I think the mentioning of a regulatory nudge from Vikki is a highlight for me. But I think in banking, the regulator did nudge, but it was Barclays and some of the other large incumbents, and then actually the venture and the tech sector heavily investing and pulling everybody through. I think that's hopefully applicable here too. But in terms of final points, Mike, if I start with you, you're on the top right of my screen.
Oh, so final point. So here at Northumbrian, we generate around 45 million data points every day. So we feel we have a genuine responsibility to get as much value from that for our customers, communities, and environments as we can. So that was our motivation for open data, and with the support of our regulator, we hope to take that forward.
And Lisa, you're next on the screen.
Yeah, for me, it's always about keeping the outcomes in mind, be it for climate change or the environment. Open data is there to enable us to do better in those areas. So it's not about the data for data's sake. It's about those outcomes and keeping that in sight.
And Claire.
Lisa stole my point, but I'm quite happy to make another one, which is that We've set an industry that's already moving quite a lot in this space, quite a big challenge, because what we've said is that open data should be open unless there's good reason not to be. But we recognise that that's going to take a very long time. And I think we're really encouraged by what we've seen through Stream and other activities that the industry is undertaking. And we'd really just like to see more of that and more progress being made. But we don't think this is going to happen overnight.
No, I think that's right, Claire. I mean, we're running a data literacy program right now for our staff, and we pushed it quite hard, but we reached about 2,500 people out of 16,000. So that warming up of the ecosystem, upskilling all the organizations involved is not going to happen over time. Vikki, what do you think? What is the big thing?
I think all the contributors made excellent points. I guess underpinning that is, how do we develop the capability that we need to be able to deliver this? And it's this data which can be community data, wider system data, policy, politics, influential factors, and what does the governance look like around some of those data streams, and how do we have the capability, and how do we start to build the capability within there? Because that there's a lot to do, and it requires quite a lot of skills and knowledge, and I think that's where some good future investment would be needed.
I think that's really good to close on. I'd just like to thank you all for joining us, and for the people who viewed and put their questions in the chat. Thank you very much for participating. I take a lot of hope and so positivity from that, because when I started as a chief data officer, we didn't really have in our industries regulators who had a specific focus on data. We didn't have, like Mike just explaining, 45 million data points that are now being understood and managed and available, or a digital water leader like we have in Arup now with Vikki. And then the ODI has always been there helping move industries through this agenda. So progress is there. I'm sure we can move faster, and hopefully this summit will help us in doing. So thank you very much for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.